Hey, welcome. This is going to be a bit of something a bit unusual for my channel, I guess. I don't know where I'll put this particular video because it's nothing to do with my normal sort of content. My name is DasTactic. Welcome to the channel. And my actual real job is as a graphic designer. That's been my job, sort of specializing in corporate identity and advertising and marketing for many, many decades. And so I came across yesterday the NASA style manual for the old worm logo back from 1976. And I was fascinated to just see how good the actual style manual was for that era. And it was very, very interesting because the history of graphics and the history of type really does also work in conjunction with the history of the technology that was available at the time. And I thought it might be fascinating, well, fascinating for me anyway, so maybe some of you might find it fascinating as well, to actually go through the style manual, but also have a look back at some of the other history of the NASA symbols. Now, the reason that this is sort of important is because yesterday they tried to launch the new sort of SpaceX / NASA, rocket with the two astronauts on board, and they've actually gone back to the worm logo, and I'm sort of fascinated with that because we haven't seen the worm logo since the early 1990s. You can see there until 1992. Now, I looked it up. What the story was that one of the directors came along and saw the old NASA symbol, this one here called the meatball. It was on the side of one of the buildings, and he actually was wondering why they weren't using the new NASA logo, and people just hadn't been using it, and I don't know why, but anyway, they hadn't been, and so he said, oh, screw it, get rid of the worm logo, we'll go back to the meatball. And so from that point forward, this much better logo was then mothballed, and they went back to this very, very problematic logo. And if I get time, I'll go through why I think this is a problematic logo. In fact, I found the style guide, the recent style guide for this one as well. So if I've got time, this is going to take a long time going through this document, by the way. The document is a good 60 odd pages, I think. And then even the new one is actually a fairly long one as well. But we can have a bit of a look at it, and I can just quickly go through the things that I don't like about this logo and why I think this one is such a much nicer logo. It's quite funny. NASA sort of with being such a big organization, like to have such a problematic logo and then go back to it after they have something that really ticks all the boxes is really, really fascinating. And there's even other little things that have sort of come since with the way that sort of NASA has, they did keep a lot of the style guiding, for example, from the worm logo, which we'll see as we go through it. So I'll talk a little bit about the history of the fonts and how things sort of work, and my sort of knowledge of these sorts of things. I've certainly spent a lot of time sort of working with typography and sort of getting a feel for it. So I'll talk a little bit about the technology as well as to why things were done that way in that era, back in the 1970s, and then sort of beyond that one. I did my training basically a decade after that, but it still is, I still know the technology that was available at that time and why certain things were done a certain way. So we can sort of start with, I guess, the first one. We can just click on this and have a bit of a look at this one. So this is the actual NASA logo. This one has a lot of problems. There's a lot of complexity, very, very hard to reproduce. You can see there back on the previous screen, this is actually being hand painted in through here onto the actual sign itself. I mean, nowadays you wouldn't do it hand painted, but anyway, this is actually being painted rather than actually using computer cut lettering, which is sort of interesting because you just wouldn't I mean, this is a modern photograph, so I'm not sure why it is being painted, but anyway, that's what's actually happening in through here. If we have a look at this font, this one I think was developed in the 1950s. Essentially, it was based on an older version. In fact, this one may have even have come more recently than that. But there are a lot of problems with this. Like even just the letter forms themselves are ugly. Like there's actually some bit of wobble in the actual forms itself. Like I don't know if I can sort of just get a little bit tighter, but you can see it's very sharp here, and then it's very sort of straight in this sort of point in this side through here. I wouldn't mind actually taking this into a graphics program and really pulling it apart. This is from the NASA site, so this one would be the actual NASA logo itself. But there's just a lot of problems with it. It's it's got in fact, if I get time, I'll go through the other NASA style guide, the more recent one, and maybe I won't talk much about this one. We'll just talk about the worm logo, because the worm logo has got a lot of other things. Like, for example, when you look at this one, the kerning, which is the or the tracking, whichever way you want to call it, is the space between the lettering. You can see this has got a lot more space in here than visually it's got in through here and in here. And in fact, if anything, this one's even tighter, and this is exacerbated because of this symbol in through this side. So even just the simple positioning of the actual letter forms themselves isn't as good as it could have been. Like, it's just a problematic logo, the way it's actually been formulated. Anyway, if I get a chance, I'll actually go through and have a bit of a look at that one. Just go back to the previous screen, and we'll have a look at this NASA one. This is weird. This is the old one from the 1970s, and they haven't even cleaned it up, which is really weird. Like, this is a really crappy reproduction in through here. NASA, get your act together. You're going back to this one. So you know, give us some good stuff to actually have a look at. This is not accurate at all. I've got no idea where they took this one from, but this is really quite a poor representation to have on your actual website of the actual logo that they've actually now decided to go back to. And it's really quite interesting that, you know, the reason that, like, they got rid of this one because of some director just on a whim saying, you know, enough, we'll go back to the meatball, because people seem to sort of like the meatball, so they got rid of the worm. And now the new NASA director that's come in for this new launch really wanted to go back nostalgically for his own, from his upbringing, because he is actually, like, he grew up with the worm logo as a child, I guess, and he just gone back and said, no, it's a better logo, let's just go with that one, which is really quite fascinating, because it's a whole new horizon now with the commercialization with NASA like this, using SpaceX to actually sort of take their stuff up, which is, I find, really, really interesting. It's to start of a whole new era, which is just brilliant. And I really quite like that they've gone back to such a classic logo, because this one works no matter what era you're going to be sort of working in. It just works, whereas the previous logo really just doesn't work. Anyway, we'll go back to the previous screen. There is also this real monstrosity through here, which is the NASA seal. It's used for formal agency events. Now, I found so many different versions of this, including on NASA sites, where the actual, and this is as big as this thing gets. This one's got lots and lots of problems. So they tried to, I think this one came first, but they didn't even use this font back in the early days. They used a different font. So this has all been sort of changed recently. And again, I don't know why they haven't styled it using the correct fonts. It's just a strange way of doing things. Like, it's ugly too, the way it's actually been sort of set up. Like, you know, it's just not done at all well. Again, the kerning, the distances between is just, it's got so, look how tight this is in through here, and then it's sort of got other problems where it loosens up. Now, it's very hard to get an R and an A to work together, but there's been no finesse here at all. And it's just the font choice is just absolutely terrible. It's not the font that they should be using based on their style guides that I've read. So, yet this is not the font that they started off with. The original font would have been better than this version. So it's really quite funny to sort of see where it's ended up. Yet, you know, they've had such a great style through here. So let's just go through this particular style guide from 1976, and I'll talk a little bit about, you know, I won't read it all out, but I'll just go through page by page and just give some comment as to my take on the different sorts of things that was in an excellent document. And it is freely available. I'll put a link in the description. Okay, so here we are. This is actually now page 1. And as I say, like, you can just go and look at this. This is from the NASA site itself. This is the graphic standard manual. Now, back in this era, like the 1976 sort of era, these were done, but not to this extent. This is actually a really, really good example of you know, something that sort of was done. It was rare back in this sort of stage. By the time you got to, say, the late 1980s and early 1990s, they were done very, very well. And it's funny because they went backwards again in the early 2000s. I came across a lot of really overdone, very unworkable style manuals or standards manuals in the early 2000s. They seem to be sort of getting a little bit better again now. So it's just funny how things sort of ebb and flow. But this is a very, very good example of an early one. So this is it from 1976. We'll just go through. It just goes through basically the index. Again, it's nice typography for the era that it's from. Very classic sort of style. Still works now, you know, even today. So, you know, it's got a very nice feel about it. It really was a great manual and a very, very good logo. Let's just go through. So we've got Dear Colleagues. This is from the administrator of the time, Richard H. Truly. So I won't read this stuff out. I think we'll just continue on through. I think it's talking more about how it's going to sort of work. Actually, maybe we should read this one out. I'll just read the pertinent areas. Yeah, so a driving force in the use of innovative techniques and ideas have brought NASA the image of a get-it-done agency, and the records back up the reputation. Put that into perspective. The way that they did the Apollo program is just an incredible story of how they sort of developed whole new ways of management and everything to get it actually done. It really was incredible. And so this is sort of like, 5 or 6 years after the first lunar landing, and there's been a few lunar landings sort of in the years leading up to this. And so NASA was on an absolute high in terms of its ability to actually get things done. And so it's interesting to sort of get the mindset that they wanted something that was going to portray that strength and that ability to actually smash through things. I really like this. This is as a designer, this is the sort of words that you like, because it gives you the mood and the flavor for what you're trying to communicate, because graphic design is just communication. And when you do a logo like this, to have that sort of information behind you is really powerful. So anyway, I'll read on. As we move ahead to an even more exciting era, so they were moving into the era, of course, of the space shuttle, in aeronautical research and space exploration, we've added a new tool to enhance and symbolize the progressive path we have always followed. Not as suspenseful as a command and service module splashdown, nor as dramatic as a Mariner flyby, is nonetheless of major importance because, actually, I should just point out, he's trying to address through here that he probably would have got a bit of flack saying, we need this, we need that, which is so often when you've actually got like a group of people getting involved in a logo creation, you end up with absolute mess because everyone wants to have as much input and as much stuff into it as they can possibly get into it. And to actually have somebody to sort of basically sort of acknowledge, yes, guys, I know that's what you want, but that's not the best way of doing it. This is actually really insightful stuff, because the old meatball one is basically, you can tell it's sort of the culmination of people saying, we need stars, we need this, we need orbits, we need, it's just a mishmash of terrible, terrible things. And so in this case, what they've done is they've actually just said, no, we're going to keep it strong and simple. So they had a very, very clear communication, which I think is fantastic. It is nonetheless of major importance because it is designed to achieve maximum communication of the agency's program objectives, both internally and externally. This is really insightful stuff. As a graphic designer, it is, because what it's doing is you've got a client who understands the subconscious and the psychological aspect of what you're doing, not just the linear. Here we are. This is a picture of something. Like this is actually, we're talking on a very, very subconscious level here, which is fantastic. So we've adopted a new system of graphics, the visual communication system by which we are known to those who read our publications, see our vehicle markings and signboards and the logotype that unmistakably brands them as NASA's. The new system focuses on a new logotype in which the letters NASA are reproduced in their simplest form, replacing the red, white and blue circular emblem with the white block letters. I think the new logotype, I don't know why it says white block letters. I would have said red block letters, but anyway, I think the new logotype is pleasing to the eye and gives a feeling of unity. You shouldn't have said I think. You should just say the new logotype is pleasing, because that actually, this is when you're dealing with committees and stuff. As soon as you say I think or anything like this, you basically are then opening the door for criticism. Anyway, not that it would really matter through here. This is the administrator after all. So I think the new logotype is pleasing to the eye and gives a feeling of unity, technological precision, thrust and orientation towards the future. These are great emotive words. These are, if you're ever trying to get a logo done, try to think of the emotive words that you actually are trying to communicate, not just physically, we do rockets, or we're going to be doing space shuttles next, or something like that, because it's these the feeling of unity, technological precision, thrust and orientation towards the future. These are the sorts of things that you can then sort of aspire to when you're doing graphic design. This is really good words. Unity, technology, pioneering, achievement. That's what NASA is all about. There we go. Beautiful, beautiful words. What a great brief. What a great brief for a logo. This manual is a reference book for NASA designers. It is an official policy document, blah, blah, blah. So I think that He says, my experience has shown that in order to succeed, a program which departs from the accustomed must have the full support of every NASA employee. Top-level management must take the lead. Our experts in the field of graphic design must follow, and all of us must see the specifics and diligently monitor to ensure that standards of excellence are maintained. God, this is so applicable to today, probably even more so to today, because so many different people now have the power to change the graphic brand of an organisation because of how easy it is now to reproduce things yourselves. Whereas back in this era, technologically, it was very difficult to reproduce anything. You really had to go through a very, very complicated process. This is before the advent of being able to use computers to actually do your typesetting for you and things like this. Everything was done photographically or by hand. It was very, very tricky, and so this is actually something that it would be good for people who are in charge of brand management to actually get this sort of statement and think, this is what we're doing, this is what we've got to do, we've got to be this stringent, because I see it so often where people pollute their own brand by letting people who don't understand the brand, including experts, get in the middle of it. I see that so often. It's just it really is depressing to sort of just see it when because there's so many people that actually do work in my field that really don't know the finer points of graphic design and don't understand the actual subconscious communication and the importance of branding. It's so strange. There's probably, I reckon, there's less than half the professional people that work in this field that actually really have an understanding of that importance. It's actually really quite rare to find. Anyway, I think we are fortunate in recognising that our graphics could stand improvement. I'm confident that the program we now have underway will be second to none in effectiveness either in government or industry, and I solicit the enthusiastic support of each of you. Yeah, so he's actually basically telling them, look, get behind this, and and of course they didn't. Because the reason they got rid of it was because they didn't. And so back in 1992, when they went back to the old version, it was on a whim, and it was because they didn't do what was said. So what a great page. This is a really, really interesting page. I haven't read any of this, by the way. I've had a flick through, and when I sort of saw it, I thought, I've got to do a video on this because this is really interesting stuff. So anyway, that's a great introduction. I know I'm gushing over it, but that is really, really nicely done. Gives you the brief, tells you the importance of actually of the branding and keeping it consistent, and of course they didn't do it. They did it for a little while, but then they didn't do it sort of all the way through the actual organisation. They didn't embrace it, obviously. Okay, let's continue on. So the logotype is a central element in NASA's visual communication system through its consistent and repetitive use as a signature device and design element in all of NASA's visual communications. The logotype becomes a visual shorthand which identifies the agency and symbolically embodies its activities, achievements and goals. So in the logotype, the letters NASA are reduced to their most simplified form. It's not the most simplified, but it certainly is simple. The strokes are all of one width, evolving the qualities of unity and technical precision. There's those words again. Elimination of cross strokes in the two A's imparts a vertical thrust. So there we go. So they're getting rid of the horizontal to a degree to try to give an upward movement. Oh, again, it's really nice to sort of see the thought process, and it lends it a quality of uniqueness and contemporary character. Now, this is back in the early mid-1970s when there was a lot of like bubble writing. Very geometric shapes were sort of prevalent in the 1970s, and so this is actually certainly a logo of the time, but it's a classic logo because it's still just as good today. And there was a lot of logos from that era that you really think, they'd work again back in the 1990s for a short period of time. I think they'd work probably about maybe another 3 or 4 years back. They'd be sort of coming back into fashion again, but they go in and out of fashion. These sort of very simplistic geometric sort of logos really are classics, and they don't sort of stop anything at all. There's a few little things that I would wonder why they chose the sharp ends on these and not actually continuing this sort of curved shape. It's sort of that would be an interesting design decision. It would be interesting to sort of know why that was done and not the curved sort of edges in through here as well. Like it sort of almost lends itself to wanting to be sort of curved to just get more of the ligature. A ligature is where you have two letters that join together like this, but it's actually very sharp. It may be to emphasize this sort of strong aspect, sort of leading upwards, the strong vertical, as opposed to the horizontal. But for me, this one really does sort of set it very solidly as a vertical. You sort of lose your flow, but maybe they need that base there. It's interesting anyway. It's just interesting to know what the thought process would have been. I'm not saying that that would have improved it. I don't think it would have improved it. It's just nice to sort of know what, you know, how many different versions. I'd love to know. I'd love to see all their notes on how many different versions they did in the sketches, because quite often you go through reams and reams of paper just finessing little bits and pieces. Also, you'll notice that, again, if you sort of squint your eyes a little bit, it's a bit closed in through here more so than in the other areas. Like these here are fairly well balanced, which is actually good. And so they've got this, because it's geometric, they can sort of keep the same distance in there and in there, but it still looks good. Like when you look at the overall effect, the kerning between the actual letters is actually really, really quite nice. And so it sort of is like the individual spacing is much more better balanced than the meatball logo, which they went back to, which is sort of funny. They didn't ever improve the meatball logo. Okay, the logotype should never be altered and distorted in any way. Yeah, blah blah blah. Now that becomes important in today's world, and so quite often style manuals will really focus on this, and this one does as well, even back in this era, where you didn't have the same level of being able to reproduce things as easily. This is before fax machines. Just to put that into context, everything was either photographic. There was a way of reproducing things, but again, it was all just done on like a photographic technology. And you did actually have you had typesetting machines in this era as well. But I don't know if they probably would have had logos in the typesetting machines, I guess, back in that era. It was a bit before my time, but it is fascinating to sort of see the actual printing styles and the way things were actually done. I'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the color versions. Okay, the agency and center identification. This is quite interesting as well, the choice in through here. So the example shown here illustrates standard configurations for NASA agency, so the agency identification. I won't talk about this too much because it's already gone to 20 minutes. This is going to be a long presentation, but you can see through here what they've done is they've actually got the lettering in through this side, where they've gone out beyond the space in through this side. They've actually gone off the vertical that's down through this side. They're using this grid line to then create the anchor point. So they're anchoring they're not centering at all, and it would be quite common to sort of see these sorts of things centered rather than anchored like this. So it's range left, ragged right, and what they've done is they've actually used the end to sort of to come off this side. There's a better version of this when we sort of have a bit of a look at it, but they've used that rather than the and you'll see when we get into the other versions, this one does sort of help. I'll just skip forward a few of these. It's got center identification to identify any of the NASA centers. The NASA logotype and full agency name is shown in conjunction with the full center name, so John F. Kennedy Space Center, back under through here. Lettering style used in the upper name is Helvetica Medium, upper and lowercase. Actually, that's not. The lettering style used in the center name, the center, yeah, that's in this one. Yeah, that's Helvetica Medium. That's Helvetica Light or even Extra Light. It looks actually almost like extra light. I'll have to have a look at that when we get a bit closer. Of course, this is hard to sort of see. The bold lettering style assures that the center name achieves primary emphasis, even though it is always preceded by the agency name. Yeah, so once again, if you sort of just glance away, then glance back at it, you certainly are drawn into the NASA as your first point of contact, or in the order of hierarchy, you've got 1, you've got 2, and then you sort of come back into this one, which again, it sort of just works. It's interesting though, like, because this would be the same point size, yet with Helvetica, you'll see that the size of the X height, the size of the N, for example, is shorter than the size of the N in through here. So it's actually not, and this is actually a vagrancy of vagary of the actual font itself. It's sort of a weird little font like this, Helvetica, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the actual fonts themselves. So the NASA color. Now this gets really quite fascinating again from a technology point of view. The correct color to use in the NASA logotype is shown below. This warm shade of red is a very active color which brings a kinetic dimension to the letter forms. The color reflects the lively and future-oriented character of NASA. NASA red should only be used when a secondary color is available and appropriate. It should be used only when a second colour is available and appropriate. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's thinking, okay, in this era, most printing was done with actual what's called spot colours, where you would actually mix your red and then print with the red. You'd have black. That would be one colour would be black. The second colour would be whatever other colour you have through here. There was what was, what is commonly called, four color printing or CMYK printing, which you've probably seen on your computers. That was also around in this time, of course, because you did have the four color magazines, but it wasn't prevalent. The most prevalent way of doing things was this very sort of graphic, minimal colors, and just like, you'd have sort of like spot colors, and really that was prevalent all the way through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and really four color and other sorts of printing techniques sort of come back more into their own towards the late 1990s, early 2000s, and from there we started to really go digital in a big way. But back in this era, it was actually done on printing presses that were more geared to printing one color at a time. And as I say, those sorts of printing presses were around well and truly into the well past the 1990s. That was still like, amongst the most common of the sort of printing presses that you would do this sort of work on. So this would have been done as a two-color job, not as a four-color print process. Whereas nowadays it would just be done digitally, and it would be done four-color digital, if that sort of helps with the technology. But so much of what you see with design, typography, the actual even type design, all comes from the technology of the era that it came from, and this logo is a reflection of that as well. So where are we? It is intended to be used only on white or a light value neutral color. NASA red should not be used with. See, it's funny that they're saying NASA red. They're calling it NASA red all the way through, but they never specify what it is. And that's actually something that within 10 years that will have then completely changed. So at this point in time, they're not specifying it on global standards. But by the early 1980s, that would then have already sort of changed dramatically, and that would then be given an actual colour, like a colour reference that people would then use in the Pantone colour matching system, which came out of, I think the Pantone colour matching system came out maybe 5 years before this did, but it hadn't really taken on. Like, it's interesting for me to see this because it had that system hadn't really grabbed certainly the NASA people at that stage. So NASA red should not be used with other bright saturated colours or medium and dark value colours, as they will dilute the effectiveness and impact of the NASA red. Further guidance on the use of the logotype in various colour situations is contained on the following page. Also refer to the guidelines on colour in the introduction of the publication section of this manual. And so we'll just go to the next page. So you can see through here, it's got the NASA logotype use of colour. So white background, against a white background, the logotype may be shown in NASA red and black or NASA warm grey. So what they've done through here is, I don't know why they've got this version of it. I don't think I've ever seen that ever used. This is an interesting sort of take on how to actually do it with the warm grey in through here. Again, that would normally be specified as to what the actual warm grey was itself. On a very light background, against a very light background, the logotype should be shown in black. The one exception would be the use of NASA red logotypes in very light areas of four-color process reproduction. There's a four-color process that it's talking about there. Black or very dark value backgrounds. Against a black or very dark colour background, the logotype should always be shown in white, so it's just showing it in through there. The logotype should always be shown in white against a background of NASA red. The logotype should never be shown in NASA red against a black or very dark background. So it's basically saying keep the reds off the blacks, which is sort of funny because nowadays people really will mix these sorts of, like back in this era, contrast was extremely important, and that has been one of these sort of design elements that people have not really adhered to in recent years, or recent decades even really, where you often will see red on black, which makes it very, very hard to read things. So you probably sort of see examples of that where they use colours now, where back in this era, the focus was really on black and white, and so it was like on high contrast, get the most contrast you possibly can into whatever you're trying to do to get the most impact. And so now we've actually gone into an era where the technology allows us to be much, much more subtle. Again, this is very much a reflection of not just style but also technology. Medium value background. Against a medium value background, the logotype can be either black or white, depending on which is more appropriate. The logotype should never be shown in NASA red against a medium value background. So it's basically sort of saying play it safe with your black and whites, and use the red if it's light enough. Interesting again. Colour standards. So here we go. So the colour swatches shown below are to be used in achieving a visual match for NASA red and NASA warm grey in any medium of reproduction. In 4-colour process printing, the formula for NASA red is solid red plus solid yellow. This is interesting for the simple reason that we no longer do this. Back in this era, when you did 4-colour process, you had like a photographic way to get a tint. And four colours are made up of like a rosette pattern of the 4 printing colours. So you've got cyan, magenta, yellow and black. And so it's sort of saying that you've got the red and the yellow needs to be solid, because in this era, to get like a stipple effect, you had to actually cut it out manually. So you'd manually have these different percentage stipples that would actually, and so the repro guys in the printing houses would actually be, they were masters at this. And this is actually a job that's no longer available. It fell away within 5 years of the advent of having computers starting to sort of do this sort of work for you. It was one of the, it went from a job that was incredibly skillful into being something that's just completely not needed at all. It's one of the, it's sort of it's really sad, because there were some really skillful operators that would actually know exactly how to sort of cut the stipples in just great ways. And so they would have all of these big cabinets full of these stipples that they would sort of lay down on the actual artwork itself on the film, because everything's done on film. They would be cutting it out with scalpels and sort of sticking it into different areas. And so in this case, it was just simple. It was just 100% red, 100% yellow. So they don't use percentage terms in here. The percentage terms, I think, must have come in more prevalently with the computers, I guess. It's funny because the solid to me makes me think of spot color from my background, and whereas solid red and solid yellow is you would not see that written today. That would be 100% yellow, red and 100% yellow, or it would be actually written as in in CMYK. It would be it would be 100R, 100Y sort of thing would be the way you sort of dictate what that one actually is. It's what it's suggesting to the printer is match this color. So use this as your color matching system. So it had its own matching system when it was actually showing this. And this would have been done as spot color. This would not have been done as a 4-color process. So even though it's saying what to do through here, the actual sample would have been a spot color. They would have mixed the red. They would have been very stringent with how they mixed the red. And then they would have said, this is the red that you have to match. This is the grey that you have to match if you're going to be matching our colours. And on the next page, actually, no, there's a few others coming up, I think. Actually, I think there's a page of swatches that you can then sort of tear off to give to printers so they can actually match the colour. And that was still done really through the 1980s, 1990s, even the early 2000s. Quite often when you were actually specifying jobs, you would actually tear off the swatches that you wanted to specify and give them to the printer so they could actually match the swatches. So yeah, it's interesting to sort of see the change in technology for me, to sort of see that this was before my training, but not that far before, and just how it was even very different to the training that I received like a decade later. So it's it's fascinating for me. Anyway, continue on. The Logotype incorrect uses. Now, we've gone for half an hour. Maybe I should split this up into a part A, part B, possibly even a part C by the looks of things. I might do that, actually. So I might leave this one here. We've gone half an hour already and we're only a few pages in. At least if I do it this way, I can spend a lot more time talking about the little bits and pieces. Hope you've enjoyed it. Actually, it's been fun for me to actually have a look at what the way things were done, and then try to second guess as to why things were done a certain way. We'll come back in the next episode and talk about the incorrect usages and how we would then do it today, and why there's different sorts of problems that they would actually have here as to opposed to the digital world. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you then.